What we are trying to do basically is to go back to a man whom I'm proud to wear on my t-shirt here today. His name is Peter Kropotkin. And Peter Kropotkin, most of you probably know who Peter or Pyotr Kropotkin was, is, or was among other things, when you go to his grave, it says one very simple thing. It says, this is the grave of Pyotr Kropotkin, the traveler. He is not a revolutionary, because he was buried under the Bolsheviks. The last great anarchist outing in Moscow was actually the funeral of Pyotr Kropotkin. And the thing about this is that he was a traveler, and that probably would be the best way to describe Peter Kropotkin. But he was also a geographer. He was also somebody who was very much involved in social sciences. And the same way that anarchism was defeated, never completely, but temporarily, in the strides, in the struggles around the October Revolution in Russia in 1917, Pyotr Kropotkin never really became a figure of importance in social sciences in the United States and outside of the United States. However, his teachings, his thinking, his incredible mind, and his incredible work captured most beautifully in the book Mutual Aid, kept invigorating and kept inspiring generation of activists, generation of people who are self-described anarchists, but also generation of people now who are also scholars. There is something of a return of Kropotkin, or return to Peter Kropotkin, that we also participate in. And this, in many ways, is also an homage to Pyotr Kropotkin. So I'm going to read you something that might seem not exactly relevant, but it is a question, it is an idea that inspired Dennis O'Hearn and myself to write a book called Living at the Edges of Capitalism, Studies in Exile and Mutual Aid, which is forthcoming with UC Press, and is going to be out in April. And I think this is the first programmatic statement of what it actually means to study mutual aid in world history, and to organize our explorations and study of world history from the perspective of mutual aid. Kropotkin was famous for framing something for a very simple thing. He said that the history of humanity is actually the history of struggles between one big struggle between the institutions of mutual aid and institutions of possessive individualism. Institutions of possessive individualism, the institutions of possessive individualism were kept, reproduced by institutions of state and institutions of capitalism. Every time, he said, there is a struggle, there is a new form of regulation, of social regulation, of discipline, new form of a state, new form of social pressure, finally capitalist state. Every time in history that happens, he said there is a double movement. People on the bottom start to organize from below. And they organize by inventing or reinventing different sociabilities, different ways of helping each other, different forms of different institutions, different practices, and different spaces of mutual aid. So the way that we frame escaping capitalism in this presentation and in our research project is we define them as, we speak of mutual aid as something that is happening in spaces that we refer to as exilic spaces, spaces of escape. Exilic spaces are those areas of social and political life where people actually escape capitalism, escape forms of control, capitalist control, control of the state. And these exilic spaces can be spaces that are territorial, or they can be spaces that are structural, but they're defined by being away as much as this is possible, and we're going to talk about how much this actually is possible, away from the processes of capitalist accumulation, and away from the processes of formal state control. In our research program, we are not actually looking for old to entertain or waste time on old sectarian debates between Marxism and anarchism and how that works in scholarship. We think that both are indispensable. The difference between anarchist scholarship and Marxist scholarship, to our mind, is actually very simple. Marxists throughout the history tended, and we can talk about why, to pay more attention to processes of exploitation, processes of domination, processes of social control. Anarchists throughout the history tended to pay more attention to processes of resistance, processes of escape, processes of struggle, and processes and moments of people actually standing outside the projects of domination, control, and exploitation. If you go too far in each direction, you end up in trouble. If you go too far, as many, I would say, majority of Marxists did, you end up becoming hopelessly cynical. The only thing you see is domination. The only thing you analyze is exploitation. The only thing you think about are forms of social control. So modern critical theory and modern positivist Marxism, let's call it that, mainstream Marxism, fell into a huge trap that sometimes a friend of mine, David Graeber, calls it the Gnostic feeling that there is no way out, feeling that humanity is doomed, feeling that every single relationship of gift, relationship of mutual aid, relationship of altruism is impossible under capitalism. Thinking that every selfless gesture is a strategic way of getting more, of accumulating more, of economizing, as economists say. So Marxism and critical theory have fell prey to this practically the same problem that most of mainstream economy bear. Basically seeing a maximizing individual who is always trying to strategize. Anarchists made a mistake on the other end. When you speak to an anarchist scholar, for example, James Scott or David Graeber or many of those wonderful people, they tend to see Raoul Zibecki, they tend to see resistance absolutely everywhere. And domination tends to be slightly neglected. Nobody really speaks how these processes of being away from capitalism and against capitalism actually contribute to perpetuation of capitalism understood as a historical system. So basically, if you go too far in each direction, you become either hopelessly cynical or hopelessly romantic. What we are trying to do is to bring these two research programs together, not to see them as enemies, not to rehearse the problems of the First International or the mainstream academia, but to do that by putting mutual aid at the very center of our research. And the thing that I wanted to tell you, to read you, is a sentence from Kropotkin that actually goes unnoticed for the most part, and I actually never really read anybody who paid enough attention to this beautiful sentence. And it's about play. And it's from Mutual Aid, for those of you who are interested in these things. It's page 25. We know at the present time that all animals, beginning with ants, going on to birds, and ending up with highest mammals, are fond of plays, wrestling, running after each other, trying to capture each other, teasing each other, and so on. And while many plays are, so to speak, a school for the proper behavior of the young in mature life, there are others which, apart from their utilitarian purposes, are, together with dancing and singing, mere manifestations of an excess of forces, the joy of life, and the desire to communicate in some way or another with other individuals of the same or other species. In short, a manifestation of sociability proper, which is a distinctive feature of all the animal world. It was probably the most and the earliest defense of playful cooperation. And what I think now, and what we are trying to do with the whole exilic spaces and the whole framework of escaping capitalism, is to make a very simple plea that might seem a little bit outrageous to many people, that we need to rethink, but we also need to unthink economy. Okay. The way that we think about economy is we are thinking about production of commodities. And I would actually argue this was not even what Marx wanted to say, but that will take us very, very, very far into the conversation. But most people studying this understood Marx to be saying that economy is about production of commodities. And that's exactly the wrong way to think about economy. Economy is about production of communal bonds.
Go.
Economy is about production of play. It's about production of community. It's production of communal relations. When you dance, you do work of building community. Economy needs to be rethought, in terms of care, in terms of mutual aid, in terms of play. Once we start doing this, everything turns upside down. The way that we think about capitalism, the way we think about resistance, the way we think about the way of defeating capitalism, the way that we think about expanding and multiplying spaces and places of resistance, seem and feel completely, not only more joyful, but completely different. And if we redefine work as play, which I think we have to, we also have to redefine what we mean by labor movement. Very much moribund in this country, unfortunately. We need to think about who is really the worker. What does worker mean? What does it mean to be? Is it a male, adult worker, factory worker, truck driver, the tired old paradigm and image that we all have? I was raised in a socialist country, so I had to endure all of this terrible iconography of people with workers with hammers and all of that kind of stuff. And it's not to say that this is not important, it's crucial, but it's not the only kind of work. And I would say this is not the most important kind of work. The most important work is the work of producing community. And that's the work of mutual aid. Once we put mutual aid at the center of historical research, we have a very different idea what politics is, what economy is, and what capitalism actually is. Because everybody who speaks about non-state spaces or who takes mutual aid as something that is extremely important neglects to say, or ends up in a sort of a weird bind. James Scott, one of the greatest anthropologists alive, one of probably the most prominent anarchist anthropologists, wrote his most recent book by saying, or finished his most recent book by saying, that there are no more non-state spaces. They don't exist. State is becoming so big, and state has defeated all the non-state spaces. So James Scott, who spent his whole life writing about resistance, ending up saying that there is no real hope, because the state is becoming so all-encompassing, the world is a global administered space, and non-state peoples and struggles were completely subdued and defeated once for all. And that's a terrible mistake. He makes that mistake because he makes this anarchist move of thinking only about the state. And he is not thinking about capitalism. And when you think only about the state as it exists somehow without capitalism, outside of the world market, when you're actually not having that form of integrated analysis, that takes us back to people like Fernand Braudel, or people like Kropotkin, or people like Immanuel Wallerstein, or people who were trying in different ways to understand this as an integrated analysis. You are, or we do end up in trouble. And we do end up with very, very boring scholarship and with very defeatist political analysis. So my project here is really to frame this conversation, to have JR, James, and Riley present on their work in progress, which is on different forms of non-state spaces, or as we would like to insist, exilic spaces, spaces of escape, and to present on different ways of actually escaping capitalism. They're going to speak about three different models. JR's work is on Exarchia, which is an anarchist and autonomous neighborhood in Greece, in Athens. What James is working on is a place that I've heard for the first time from James, but apparently is a big thing in California. It's called Slab City. He did his research on people who, are sometimes called dropouts, marginals, who end up living in Slab City and doing all kinds of interesting things there that he's going to talk about more. And Riley's research is about a place that is very counterintuitive when you speak about escaping capitalism. It's about prisons. Now, Riley had spent a lot of time working on prisons. And what she discovered, especially through her correspondence with Todd Ashker, Alfred, and other people who were on hunger strike, and you all know about the Pelican Bay story, her correspondence and her research with most people from, she will tell you more about that particular political collective, led her to believe that prison at the same time is the very center of capitalist society, and at the same time it's at the margins of capitalist society. So it takes us away from the idea that people in prison are completely defeated, subjugated, and that they have no room or space for resistance. Quite the contrary, and she will tell you much more about this. So it's my great pleasure to introduce JR, James, and Riley, who are going to speak more about this, and we are going to come back. I'm going to ask them 3 questions, and then we're going to open the space for discussion. Hopefully we're going to have enough time. I think the first person to speak is going to be James.
Okay, so I guess we'll start with how do we escape capitalism, or where are there opportunities to escape capitalism, and what line of thinking would lead to that? And so I'm going to start with this Italian autonomous Marxist theorist. His name's Mario Tronti, and he developed this kind of alternate Marxist interpretation called the Copernican inversion. So in like orthodox Marxism, capitalism is typically perceived as the despair of the unfortunate in the wake of like superior dominance of capital. So capital is dictating everything, and working class people are kind of just at its whim. And so Tronti kind of flipped that upside down and saw basically labor as potentially autonomous from capital, because it views capital as essentially adjusting based on proletarian struggle and resistance to labor in general. So basically it's saying that the capacity of the working class to dictate the development of capitalism is an opposite interpretation. So creating an outside to capitalism by the working class would be a way that could potentially lead to its demise, or a way to escape capitalism itself, because of capitalism not being able to develop and reproduce due to working class refusal to participate. And so basically, okay, so this also includes with not just working, where by withdrawing yourself from that traditional mode of capitalist production, you begin to stop those processes from functioning correctly, but also the reproduction of capitalism. And so Silvia Federici talks about reproduction, reproductive labor that exists outside of formal sites of production that are uncompensated, and therefore kind of create a consciousness that they are somehow different. But it's not just the sense of procreation, reproduction, but also all activities necessary for the reproduction of human life. So housework, subsistence agriculture, production of culture and care for the environment, these are all expropriated and are uncompensated work that help reproduce capitalism's development. And so not only by withdrawing from formal sites of production, not only is there the surface effect of stifling its development, but there's also this reproductive effect as well. Because as you start to escape from those sites and create your own forms of organization, collective organization, you begin to stop capitalism's ability to reproduce itself based on the expropriation of unwaged labor. And so basically the exploitation of labor by capital signifies capital's reliance on who it has authority over, and therefore is an indication of, I don't think its power, but of its vulnerability. So basically, all right, so capital's need to escalate its exploitation is a component of its struggle against its reliance on the proletariat, because against its current state is the brainchild of labor, which is the very force it tries to dominate. And so the result of this is that basically if capital is left with nothing to extract from, then it can't reproduce itself. And so this is why I'm interested in these kind of exilic spaces where you begin to not only continue to reproduce capitalism through traditional workforce, but also through reproduction. And so these outsides to capitalism or exilic spaces are places where struggles elicit nourishment and where, different forms of politics and mutual aid can be developed. And while I'm living in Slab City in this anarchist library called the Lizard Tree Library that's completely constructed from salvaged and repurposed materials. It only possesses things that were donated. It relies on only donations. It's a 24-hour public space. There's access to water. We have 3 meals that we cook every single day collectively. We pool our resources. We're bathing from cold springs instead of using institutional access to resources. We're using low power solar panels for LEDs that are very inexpensive. So by withdrawing from a lot of these everyday life practices and collectively organizing, we are beginning, I'd like to think, to escape from capitalism and its ability to reproduce itself.
Cool. So thinking exilic spaces in the prison, I think is a project that entails this sort of double movement. So while these revolutionary spaces undoubtedly do exist, and we see evidence of them here in California with the work of the Short Corridor Collective in Pelican Bay and their solidarity.
Can you speak a little louder?
Yeah, I'm sorry. So we see them here in California with the work of the Short Corridor Collective in Pelican Bay and their solidarity organizing tactics. They exist inside the body of the state, are made up of people who did not choose their exile per se, but regardless, when prisoners take space and voice, they're doing so in direct confrontation and refusal of the state and state spaces. So what I want to do in my part of this panel is to talk about prisons as these sort of inside-outside spaces, and then to recount the struggle that's been going on specifically here in California. I could talk for hours about the different prison uprisings as well as forms of everyday resistance that take place and have been taking place in prisons for decades. But due to time constraints, I'm going to limit myself to the exilic community that has emerged here. So first, I want to address prisons as a part of capitalism and the capitalist world system. Inevitably, when people start discussing this, they resort to this idea of a prison-industrial complex. And this isn't the strategy that I'm going to take, because I believe it offers a really limited view of the role that prisons play in upholding the capitalist world system. Certainly, prisons in the United States are a source of profit for corporations. The privatization of prisons is, of course, a key indicator of this, as is the privatization and exploitation of prison labor. But within this thing that we call the prison-industrial complex, the logic is that this privatization and exploitation of prisoners is the driving force behind mass incarceration. And that is the assertion that I want to problematize, because the state itself does not profit from the expropriated labor of prisoners, or even from their incarceration. Sure, taxes are in theory collected from these corporations, but that income doesn't account for a very substantial gain for the state itself, and the state easily spends that much and more on the carceral system. The relationship of power and production going on here, I would argue, is something altogether different. Rather than gaining from their labor itself, the state system is benefited by spending less than otherwise would to support labor that's been deemed superfluous. Louis Quaquin has referred to prisons as, quote, a judicial garbage disposal into which the human refuse of the market society are thrown. So mass incarceration is a tool to criminalize and further destabilize an already precarious workforce, ultimately dangerous to the situation and at the same time a means of entrenching precarious labor as the norm. The penal apparatus not only stores excess labor, but the expropriation of capital in the form of profit, as well as resources diverted from social welfare, has the tendency to push workers not yet caught in the net of penality towards further precarity, and to incarcerating these dangerous classes whose political power may upset the equilibrium of the current state of affairs, ostensibly moves that potential political power from their communities. This is not simply a matter from profiting from their labor, but from labor that's removed from networks of exchange and warehoused en masse where it can be drawn upon as needed, An example of this would be the cheap prison labor that was used to fight fires in California over the summer. So when viewed from this perspective, mass incarceration takes its place within a much wider network of relations of power and production. We can much more easily place it within the capitalist world system as one instance of carceral control used no longer to discipline and punish communities, which Foucauldian theory asserts as another nigh unquestionable accepted piece of dogma, but simply to remove them until such time that their labor is useful. What is appropriated is not their labor, but potential labor and the need for social welfare, which leads us to question as well the role of the prison as an edifice of discipline and punishment. As I just mentioned, Foucauldian theory treats it as a totalizing system of domination. The state has created a system of surveillance that enables it to perfectly know its population, to control that population through knowledge, and in the prison to determine every facet of their lives through that control. Imprisonment is the ultimate form of this system of control. Indeed, it is the system of control made manifest in space. It is hegemony itself, with the panoptical state operating through technologies of coercion and control to impose a particular enactment of power upon the populace. And this is where I disagree. If there's hegemony to be spoken of here, it can only be spoken in relation to counter-hegemonic struggle. And when we speak of the prison as an all-encompassing edifice, we essentially remove the possibility of resistance from incarcerated people. This kind of structuralism obscures real human relations within space, and furthermore it's state-centric and therefore in direct conflict with revolutionary politics. What needs to be introduced to the frame is an understanding of the different ways in which space is lived, which I would argue underpins the emergence of exilic space within the body of the state. So there are two ideas here. One is representations of space, the dominant or hegemonic description of space, the prison as it ought to be as far as the state is concerned, the prison that holds to its purpose, the prison that is described by Foucault. The second is representational space, and any of you who are familiar with Lefebvre can probably see already what I'm getting at here. Representational space is space as it is lived, space inhabited, the space that's the locus for the production and reproduction of social relationships. An exilic space that exists within and against the state, rather than in a spatially different or distant location, resides within the realm of representational space. Looking at space from this perspective uncovers the potential for everyday forms of resistance. In the prison, everyday forms of resistance might be the refusal to walk in an orderly fashion or hoarding feminine hygiene products against regulations, as well as this radical self-realization of oppositional socio-spatial creation. This opens up pathways to escape. So what is it about solitary confinement that makes this kind of escape possible? Those who inhabit the shoe are already exiles. They've been expelled from the state, while at the same time being held within it. They are arguably no longer of interest to the panoptical state, as for all intents and purposes, their actual being is no longer important to it. Their whatever rights or privileges these individuals may have had outside the shoe have gradually been stripped away, and it's this stripping, this act of near total expulsion, that opens up the potential for an exilic space to emerge.